All right, our next presentation is by Charuleka Varadharajan. She's from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and she's going to be talking about improving predictability while reducing model complexity, while incorporating KGML.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I'm Charu from Berkeley Lab. I'm a computational earth scientist there. And I'm very pleased to be giving this talk here because this represents a body of work that's a long-term collaboration with the University of Minnesota, and specifically Vipin's group, through the work of Jared Willard, who's a recent graduate from here. And he's now a postdoc at Berkeley Lab with the NERSC Supercomputing Center. And I also want to acknowledge that this work is sponsored by the Department of Energy through various awards, including a DOE Early Career Award. So I'm here going to be talking about I'm really pleased that these set of talks came together because it's saving me a lot of introduction and motivation for this. So I can jump into what we're doing. But I also think that the discussion questions that came up are also good motivators for what I'm going to be talking about. And it's sort of this question about model complexity, going after accuracy, and how do we sort of go after the most simple models that we really want? Why do we want to add complexity when it's not needed? So my research is focused on understanding how climate change and extreme events such as extreme rainfall, heat waves, floods, droughts, how these impact watersheds. And watersheds are the fundamental units of how water flows on the earth, and that's how we manage water. And it offers sort of various functions that are of interest, physical and chemical functions like stream flows and water quality, but also biological functions, things like biodiversity, forest health. And since our research is focused on how disturbances impact these watersheds, these are unpredictable events. They can occur anywhere, anytime. You don't know ahead a priori where this event is going to occur. So we have to be focused on sort of this out of sample generalization question of doing predictions in unmonitored regions where you don't really have data. And there's a large diversity of catchments I'm going to be, or watersheds. We sort of use these terms interchangeably in hydrology. They have various what we call traits, and I'm going to be talking about that today. And we want to understand how these different types of watersheds respond, or whether they're vulnerable or whether they're resilient to these types of disturbances. So this predictions in unmonitored regions has been a grand challenge in hydrology. There's been decades worth of work done in this space, mostly using process-based models. But recently, these deep learning models, Jake introduced them, some of the work that by Kratzer et al. They've built these very large-scale deep learning models that have significantly started to outperform the process models. So we've done a recent survey of emerging machine learning methods that have been used for these sort of spatiotemporal predictions in unmonitored regions. This was work that Jared led as part of his thesis. And we found that, this is across various different types of variables that you'd want to care about in water resources. And we found there's still some open questions. The first being, of course, the classic machine learning question of what model architecture do we use? We're doing some work in this space that I'm not going to touch upon today, but we're finding that maybe it's not one model architecture. We're finding ensembles actually are doing pretty well when we start to combine different things. There's an open question of what's the right scale of to build these models. How much data do you incorporate in these models? So do you want to build one large model that incorporates all the data, or do you want to build subsets or groups that maybe are smaller models? Do you use transfer learning to extrapolate from local predictions to larger predictions? And sort of, again, I'm not going to talk about it today, but the gist of our work is saying that these large continental scale or as large a model as you can build with as much information as you can pull in outperform sort of subsets of data when you use them in deep learning models. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how do you select the input variables that go into this model? And sort of since it's this KGML workshop in the framing that Anuj presented today, we're definitely more on the machine learning centric side of things, partly because when you're working at very large spatial scales, the theory is sort of poor, the theory in the sense of process models. They exist at what we call intermediate basin scales, like what Jake presented. But when you're at very large spatial scales, particularly for variables like water quality, you don't really have good process models that run at such large scales. So we're kind of leaning towards the deep learning version. So the question that we ask is, how do you select an optimal set of input data for these broad scale models? And I'm going to be, as mentioned before, these long short-term memory networks are very popular in hydrology. They're sort of the benchmark model to beat. And this is an adaptation. We're focused on stream temperature predictions, which Jake introduced. This is an adaptation of the model that Kratzer had built for flows, but it takes inputs as stream flow and meteorology. These are dynamic inputs. But that model also, for the sort of purpose of generalization, this predictions in unmonitored regions, uses what they call static site-specific attributes. These are properties of these different sites. We are going to call them watershed traits in this talk. And that provides that information across all of those different regions that allows the model to generalize outside of the regions that it's being trained for. Now, there's been more recent work in sort of this hydrological machine learning space saying, are these models actually learning from these attributes? Or do these traits actually provide any value? There's work that, John and Xiang Li have led about, doing random vectors, and they're like, maybe it's not. And then there's some other work that's more recent that was just presented in a conference a couple of months ago saying, hey, those traits don't really add any information. The deep learning model isn't benefiting from it. Well, so, the question from a domain scientist perspective is like, they have to be providing useful information. This is a domain scientist view. These traits control watershed functions. There's a whole sort of literature in hydrology that's focused on understanding what are the traits that control watershed functions. So how can these deep learning models not learn from them, or are they doing the right thing if they're not learning from them? So what are these traits, right? So these are questions about things like their average climate, their topography, their geology, their vegetation, their land use. And I want to point out that they're not static. Actually, some of them, these traits co-evolve, they co-vary with each other. But from at least a deep learning perspective, and for today, we're going to treat them as static. And they do influence various types of functions. In fact, we have a very large Department of Energy project in the Colorado River Basin that's using an extraordinarily large process model to model various functions like stream flow, forest health, as well as biogeochemistry by incorporating trait information into the model. So how do you do that? In a process model, we call this concept functional traits. When you incorporate the trait in a model, they become a functional trait because they're trying to predict a function of interest. And in a process model, you would do this using parameters or things like it can be used for defining model structure or some threshold variables. There's various ways to do this. How do you do that in machine learning models? And that's a big question. I don't think that's really been explored. And more importantly, which of these functional traits have the most predictive power, or do they even have predictive power at this point? So fortunately, we're now in this sort of era of big data where we have a lot of trait information. There's plenty of remote sensing data sets from which you can glean all these sorts of different traits. And now there's a lot of trait data products that are out there that are that we can start to leverage. And so the one that I'm going to be talking about today is called the Gauges 2. It's put out by the USGS. It has information actually on a lot of traits, of over 300 traits, but 274 of them are non-categorical for over 9,000 catchments. But there's others that also exist that provide information at more detailed levels. And again, for those of you who are ML people, computational folks, these are tabular data. These are not images, and they're providing a lot of information on properties such as climate, land cover, vegetation, even human disturbance, like things like dams, et cetera. So the first question is, you have 274 traits. How do you incorporate that into a model? And then you come down to the classic approach of let's do dimensionality reduction, right? So the traditional way to do this would be let's cluster them using some unsupervised clustering approach like k-means or hierarchical clustering. We've used a different approach. I've had a talented postdoc, Fabio Chula, who was a physicist trained in network science, and he came up with this new method to use networks to do the dimensionality reduction. And we found that actually this approach allows you to sort of outperform the traditional k-means and hierarchical clustering, because those are based on Euclidean distance, whereas the networks allow you to use alternative distance metrics like a cosine distance. In sort of this figure here, we published a paper that came out earlier this year on how we did this network approach. We actually did a PCA to reduce the dimensions, but it doesn't reduce it enough. It's still in a high dimensional space after the PCA. And then you build two networks. You build a network of traits and a network of catchments. And then you can sort of do the classification for both traits and catchments. We since then improved upon this method where you eliminate that PCA step and you can directly go to the catchment and trait networks. So what you end up resulting in, looks like the format's a little bit off on this version, but like there basically you can condense this information from the 274 traits into 25 trait categories. And you can end up, so drastically, because these traits are highly correlated, they're, things like, just to give you an example, if you think about precipitation, you'll have August precipitation, September precipitation, July, each one of those is a trait, right? Obviously, they're highly correlated. So you reduce the redundancy in this information using this approach. And then what you can do is to start to classify these catchments based on that attribute information, the trait information. And what we find is that actually, surprisingly, we didn't put any spatial information in, there's no spatial information in these traits. But when you do the classification, you find that there's spatial patterns that are emerging because of these traits. These are not arbitrary. They're all sort of, the traits are co-evolving, and these catchments end up being in similar regions. And so that's pretty remarkable to see that that geographic clustering is happening just based on their properties, no spatial information provided. The other thing you can start to do is to now start to get interpretability because of this trait information. So here on the top, I'm showing you a map of one cluster that is not geographically clustered, and it's the human developed areas, primarily cities and things like that, which are geographically spread out. That kind of makes sense. And in that network, you see that overexpressed area on the top here. I don't know if my mouse would work. This region here that shows that those are the traits that are representing those developed areas. And we've now got these 25 trait categories. What we do is we aggregate those scores in how this network is built into a z-score that tells you how are those particular traits important relative to the rest of the country. So in this case, this cluster of catchments has an overexpression of developed areas, and we can then start to relate that to hydrological behavior. So there are things called stream flow indices. They're sort of summary statistics of, oh, okay, I got to speed up here, of things, and we can find that developed areas are more prone to flooding. So we're now able to reduce this redundancy in this trait information. And so we now apply this into a deep learning model that we've done for stream temperature prediction at over 1,400 sites. And we've created a fake unmonitored scenario with about sites that have low observations, about 580 sites. And we did a model experiment here with these different trait combinations. So one, we did all the 274 sites. The second one that we did with just some hand-selected experts, some extremely good experts selecting about 21 sites. And then there's this network approach that we use to see whether this can help reduce the model complexity. And this is work that Jared did. And sort of the bottom line message here is that, we can, all these models actually are kind of comparable. You can pretty much get away with 1/10 the information that you put into the models with very similar accuracy. Yeah, there's some second decimal place errors somewhere, but more or less they perform well. But this doesn't tell you the whole story. And we are also interested in sort of the warmest 10% because we're looking at extreme events and how those influence these catchments. And even from that perspective, these models are comparable. But when you look at across the time series, this graph, I think, is more illustrative of what's going on here. The expert hand-selected, the domain-selected sort of performance, which is in the blue line, it's sort of off, particularly in those peak summer periods, and the bias is really high. But that z-score, that network approach, actually mirrors very closely this Uber model that has all the 274 traits. It's kind of probably over parameterized. It's got a lot of information. You can actually reduce your model complexity very significantly, but do almost as well in terms of predictive accuracy as well as bias. And so that kind of gives you hope that you can really do this and you can really reduce the model complexity. But sort of that's not the end of the story. When you look at the individual sites and how individual sites are performing, now that's actually pretty surprising. You would think that if the deep learning model were able to handle redundancy, you'd throw in all the information, it would always outperform something that's smaller. It doesn't. And it doesn't, and there's no clear patterns on whether which of these three different models perform well for all sites. There are some sites where all the entire 274 traits performs slightly better, some where the other two approaches perform better. So we're now trying to understand these model errors and trying to figure out when and where do these models predict well. So I'm almost done. Here, this is sort of our error analysis. We're using this trait information and saying, are there properties of sites that make them less predictable? And I don't have time to get into this, but in general, what we can say is there's pretty significant consistency across the three different approaches that we've used in terms of which perform well and which do not perform well. In general, we found that sites that have deep groundwater influence and base flow, for example, are less predicted, and there are good reasons for why that might be happening. But this is sort of the kind of thing that you can start to do when you have this attribute information. But overall, I just want to say that these traits do matter from a machine learning model. If you do just a simple permutation, importance, Jared did something very clever by just throwing in the combined gauges attributes, and you find that they do come pretty high up in that importance ratio. And we were wondering if that's maybe encoded in one of the dynamic inputs. So we took that dynamic input stream flow out, and you still see that that's being important. So sort of the key takeaway from this is, we want to use our scientific knowledge so that we can optimize sort of this trade-off between model accuracy and complexity for real world problems. You might lose some second decimal place accuracy, but it's acceptable in a real world scenario. And you really want to use models that perform well with the least amount of data, because we're in data sparse scenarios almost all the time in scientific machine learning. And so I want to say that our results are showing that this sort of choice of traits are important, but adding more features isn't necessarily helpful. This network-based dimensionality reduction can help us reduce this input feature redundancy and reduce this model complexity, which is really important when you kind of think about ensembles and you want to do large ensembles. You really don't want to increase your compute needs because of large models. But that there's still a very open question about how you select these ideal input features that have the greatest predictive performance, but with meaningful process knowledge that makes sense from a domain perspective. I think that's still a good open question for discussion. So thank you. And I want to.
Okay, questions for Charu?
Thanks for the great talk. And I applaud you for trying to reduce complexity. And my question is related to that. Often what we hear, what people want is, yes, an accurate model, but then they are very interested in a question like, what if 10% of agricultural lands are converted to urban areas? What will be the impact on stream temperature? And it's related to reducing complexity because you want the model to be responsive to that change in input variable. And if it's often hard to get the response that you want from changing that input variable. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on methods for moving the field forward in terms of being able to do scenario-based testing with these static features.
Okay, so first of all, I want to point out that these are not static features. If you were changing land use, then you would really ideally want a dynamic representation, right? And if we had the data, I'm hoping someday, I'm dreaming that the USGS is going to come out with a dynamic trait product that I could just use instead of having to create it. Then you would be able to represent that in a model like this. So you don't have essentially the same thing across all states, right? So you could do this. So I think for that specific example that you pointed, incorporating dynamic trade information is actually really important. Did that answer your question or not really?
Sometimes even when you do have the dynamic in the case of like streamflow prediction, if you change the knob of like how much water is being released, sometimes you don't get the response that you expect, even though overall the model is performing well.
Yeah, that's something I think we're starting to explore with because we're starting to look at the influence of dams, but I don't have a good answer for you. I think we're finding similar things at this point. Yeah.
One quick question, then we got to go on.
I don't know if it's quick, but it's a follow-up on the previous one. So this approach of we need only 10% or 5% of data to get the same accuracy, I think biases two things. One is accuracy as a metric of performance, and you've alluded to this, that it doesn't actually cover all areas at all times. And so then getting away from accuracy, how do we look at, and it's also not all 10% of data are good. Not you need quite often to get to the other 90% to figure out which 10% you actually need to get to this model performance. And so how do we then maybe refocus the process on the long tail, which typically is where interesting things are actually happening and where policy decisions or interventions have the most impact, or any changes in the uncertainty of the data or the selection of which 10% have the most impact?
Yeah, you hit on two of my most favorite topics, so I could go on for a long time, but I'll keep it brief. I think we do need to think about metrics as a community. I've brought this up multiple times in different workshops, and as sort of as a domain scientist perspective, it's not just accuracy. I mean, there's bias in other more quantitative metrics, but we do want to think about how we evaluate these models, particularly when you're applying them for real world scenarios for decision making. And so I've kind of trying to find a group of people who would want to work on metrics as sort of a separate question. Your second thing about data, I think that's extraordinarily important, and this is a point I've been trying to make for a while, is that there's a lot of focus on architectures and models and fixing the models and building the right models. And there's unfortunately not as much in the domain side, at least, focus on the data and figuring out what types of data are best suited to put into the models. And I think this is an area that's very rich. We need to, these are data-driven models. They learn from data, and we have to focus on what data are important, what quality they are, and what does AI-ready data mean? I actually am a data expert. It's not clear to me what that means. So I think that's a very rich area of research as well. So thanks for allowing me to sort of talk about two of my favorite topics.
Thank you. We're going to have to move on.